The drone arrived at 0400 hours, Earth Standard Time, and nobody shot it down. That was the first mistake. I was on Orbital Station Kestrel when it happened, standing at the viewport with a cup of cold coffee in my hand, watching the Kelvoran fleet sitting fat and patient in low orbit like it owned the sky. 300 warships. Maybe more. We had stopped counting after the first week, because counting made it feel more real, and real was something none of us could afford to be right then. My name is Cale Morrow. I am 31 years old. I am a Marine of the Earth Defense Corps, and I had been awake for 22 hours when the drone slipped through our perimeter like a letter pushed under a door. Lieutenant Diane Hollis was the one who pulled me out of my fog. She came through the corridor at a half-run, her boots loud on the deck plating, her face doing that thing it always did when something had gone sideways, that tight, careful expression she wore when she was deciding how worried to be. "Cale," she said, "Command wants everyone in the briefing room. Right now." I set the coffee down. I did not say anything. I followed her. The briefing room on Kestrel held 40 people when it was packed. There were 63 of us in there when Commander Owen Price pulled up the holographic display and let the drone's message play. Price was a broad man, with gray at his temples and the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from having decided, long ago, that panic was a luxury he could not afford. He let the message play twice, without comment, and then he turned to face us. The message was from the Kelvoran Directorate of Civilization Management. That was actually the name of their department, Civilization Management. The document they transmitted was called the Kelvoran Mercy Clause, though in the official translation it was referred to more formally as the Surrender Protocol. It was 61 pages long, rendered in 12 languages, and its terms were laid out with the kind of clean, bureaucratic confidence that told you the people who wrote it had never once imagined anyone would argue with it. 80% of Earth's landmass would be transferred to Kelvoran colonial administration. All human military assets, from orbital platforms to personal sidearms, would be catalogued and decommissioned. A population ceiling would be established, to be maintained through methods the document described only as standard biological governance. In exchange, humanity would be granted what the protocol called a supervised continuance, which was their phrase for being allowed to exist in a smaller, quieter, controlled version of ourselves, under the watchful eye of an alien administration that had already decided what kind of people we were permitted to become. There was a response window of 72 hours. The document noted, in a small footnote near the back, that no contacted species had ever declined. Owen Price read that footnote aloud to us. He read it slowly. Then he looked up. "Thoughts?" he said. For a moment, nobody spoke. I could hear the ventilation system. I could hear someone at the back of the room breathing through their nose. I watched the people around me, the way their faces moved through the information in the document, the way their expressions shifted from careful reading to something harder and more personal. These were not people who had joined the Corps expecting an easy assignment. They had signed up knowing that the Kelvoran had been on the edge of our detection range for 8 years, that first contact was coming, that it was not likely to be a peaceful introduction between equal parties. They had prepared for something difficult. What they had not prepared for was being handed a document that said the preparation was already over, that the outcome was already decided, and that all they needed to do now was sign their names and accept a smaller life. Corporal Eddie Flynn, who was 23 years old and from a small town in northern England and who had joined the Corps because he wanted to see the stars, raised his hand. "Sir," he said, "is the footnote serious?" "They actually put that in there." "They did," Price said. "Right." Flynn thought about it for a second. "So they've never had anyone tell them no?" "Apparently not." Flynn scratched the back of his neck. He had the kind of face that was always honest about what he was thinking, which made him a terrible card player and an excellent person to have in a briefing because you could always read the room through his expressions. What his face said now was that he had processed the information, found it remarkable, and was already moving past the remarkable part toward the practical part. "That's going to be a bit of a shock for them then, isn't it?" he said. And that, in its bare simplicity, was the whole of it. That was the moment I watched 62 people in a room stop being frightened and start being something else entirely. It was not bravery exactly. Bravery is the decision to do something despite fear. And what I saw in the room was not people deciding anything. It was people recognizing something. It was the sudden, collective understanding that the thing they were looking at was not a decision at all. It was an insult. It was 61 pages of someone else's certainty that they did not matter enough to fight for themselves. And recognizing it as an insult was the same as knowing what you were going to do about it. I was not in the room when Earth's governing council received the protocol. I watched it on a feed from the station's communications deck, sitting beside Diane Hollis and a tech specialist named Owen Garrett, who was 26 and had never seen combat but had the kind of steady hands and sharp mind that made him invaluable in a crisis. The council session was closed, but the audio leaked within 4 hours, because things always leak when enough people are furious enough, and the people in that room were extremely furious. What the feed captured was not panic. That was what struck me most. There was anger, yes. There was a long period of overlapping voices that the automated transcript struggled to process. There were at least 3 moments where someone senior in the chain of command used language that would never survive an official record. One delegate from the Pacific Coalition had apparently swept a water glass off the table, which the feed picked up as a sharp crack, followed by a short silence, and then the voices came back louder than before. But underneath all of it, threading through every exchange like a wire pulled tight, was something I had no name for at the time. I have thought about it since, in quiet moments and in not-so-quiet ones, and the closest I can get is this. It was recognition. Humanity looked at the protocol and recognized it. Not because we had seen it before from aliens, but because we had seen its shape in other forms across our own history, across centuries of being told by one power or another that the sensible, practical, logical thing was to accept what we were offered and be grateful it was not worse. We knew what that document was. Not just what it said, we knew what it was. We had lived inside things like it. We had carried their weight. We had, eventually, at great cost and over great spans of time, decided what we thought of them. The protocol was not a new idea. It was the oldest idea there was. And we had been saying no to it in one form or another since long before we reached the stars. The 72-hour window ran out on a Tuesday morning. The formal reply was transmitted at 0900 hours, Earth Standard Time, from the United Earth Assembly, in 17 languages. The Kelvoran translators would later report that they had difficulty with several phrases, particularly one drawn from a regional English idiom that had been included by a delegate from Lagos who argued, successfully and at considerable volume, that it captured the spirit of humanity's position more precisely than anything more formal could manage. The alien linguist spent 3 days attempting to understand the idiom before concluding that it was, possibly, an error in transmission. It was not an error in transmission. Up on Kestrel, we did not celebrate when the reply went out. We were not the celebrating kind, not then, not with 300 warships sitting outside the viewport. What we did was get to work. Owen Price called his section leaders together within the hour, and those section leaders called their teams, and in the hours that followed, there was a great deal of movement and noise, and the kind of focused, productive activity that looks like chaos from the outside, and feels, from the inside, like the only sane possible response to an impossible situation. I was assigned to Defensive Line 4, a corridor network on the station's lower arm that would be the first point of contact if the Kelvoran attempted a boarding action. I spent the next 18 hours helping to fortify it with Flynn and Garrett and 4 other people whose names I want you to know, because they matter. Corporal Lena Briggs, who was a former competitive archer from Wales and had reflexes that seemed unfair to everyone around her. She had a habit of assessing physical spaces the way other people assessed conversations, in terms of angles and distances and where you would want to be if things went badly. And this habit had already saved people's lives before the war started, and would save more before it ended. Private First Class Colin Shaw, quiet and careful, who read physical books and always had one in his chest pocket. He was not the kind of person who said much in group settings, but when he spoke, it landed because he had already thought it through twice while everyone else was still on the first pass. He was from a village in the English countryside, and he had joined the Corps because he believed, simply and without drama, that some things were worth defending. Sergeant Nina Rourke, who had been with the Corps for 9 years and who spoke in short, precise sentences that somehow always contained exactly what needed to be said. She had the quality of a person who has seen a great deal and has organized it all into a framework that does not easily break, and the framework held during every hard moment of what was coming. And Private Danny Marsh, the youngest of us at 20, who was almost certainly afraid and who dealt with it by talking constantly and well, in a way that kept the rest of us from retreating too far into our own heads. He had a quality I did not have a word for then and still struggle to describe, the ability to make the people around him feel that whatever they were carrying was real and seen and shared, without ever making it feel heavier. We worked, we planned, we argued about angles of approach and load-bearing points and which sections of corridor could be blocked without cutting off our own retreat routes. Flynn kept making suggestions that were either brilliant or completely impractical, and the line between those two things was different every time, which kept the planning sessions lively in a way that was probably good for morale even when it was irritating. Outside the viewport, the Kelvoran fleet did not move. They were waiting, we understood later. They were waiting for the corrected transmission. They were waiting for the follow-up message that every species eventually sent, the one that said there had been a mistake, a misunderstanding, an unfortunate miscommunication, and that of course humanity would like to revisit the terms of the protocol in a more cooperative spirit. The follow-up message never came. What came instead, on the 4th day, was a second drone. This one was not carrying a document. It was carrying a very short message, 11 words in the primary Kelvoran diplomatic register, which translated as, "We are uncertain you understand the nature of your situation." Owen Price read it to us at evening assembly. He read it twice, slowly, with the same flat attention he gave everything. He then asked if anyone had a response they would like to suggest. Lena Briggs raised her hand and offered one. It was brief. It was, in its own way, remarkably accurate. It was also, Price decided after a short pause, probably not suitable for official transmission, though he wrote it down, which told you what he actually thought of it. "Close, though," he said. "I thought so, sir," Briggs said. Garrett beside me kept his face very still, which was his version of laughing. We kept working. The fleet kept waiting. And somewhere down on Earth, in rooms I would not see for another 8 months, people far smarter than me were already doing the math on what came next. Already building the plans that the Kelvoran Directorate of Civilization Management had never once needed to prepare for because no contacted species had ever declined. We had declined. The sky outside the viewport was full of ships that had never been told no. The footnote in the protocol said so. 8,000 years and 214 civilizations, and not one of them had looked at 61 pages of bureaucratic certainty and said, "Actually, no, we had looked at it, we had set it down, and now we were going to show them exactly what that meant." There is a particular quality to silence just before something changes. It is not peaceful. It is the silence of a held breath, of a system at tension, of something enormous, balanced on a point so small you could miss it if you blinked. I had felt it twice before in my life. Once as a child, standing at the edge of a very high diving board, looking at the water 30 feet below and understanding that the only way forward was to stop thinking and move. Once on my first deployment, in a narrow street in a city I am not supposed to name, in the half-second before everything became noise and light and the specific, clarifying terror of a situation with no theoretical dimension at all. I felt it again on the 14th day after the protocol deadline, standing at my post on Defensive Line 4 when the Kelvoran fleet began to move. Not toward Earth. Not at first. They moved into formation. A specific formation, precise and geometric, that our analysts identified within minutes as the Kelvoran pacification array. It was, according to the intelligence files compiled over the first week of contact, a formation they used at the beginning of every engagement with an uncooperative contact species. It was ceremonial as much as tactical. It was the shape that said, "This is how things end." It communicated through its geometry alone that what followed had already been decided, that the result was a function of the process, and that the process had been run successfully 214 times before. The comms channel crackled. Owen Price's voice came through, steady and plain. "All stations, this is command. They're opening their playbook. Let's open ours." The Kelvoran playbook began with a precision strike on all identified command infrastructure. Communication relays, power junctions, central processing nodes. It was designed to cut the head off any military operation in the first 90 seconds. It had worked that way 214 times, across 214 species, on 214 worlds. The Kelvoran Directorate had files on all of them, thick files, detailed files, files that described exactly how long each species had held out and what made them finally decide the cost of continuing was too high. What they did not have a file on was humanity's particular approach to redundancy. We had spent the 14 days of silence well. Every critical system on Kestrel and on the 7 other orbital stations had been duplicated, rerouted, and in several cases physically moved to locations that no logical survey of our infrastructure would have identified as useful. The power junction that the Kelvoran targeting system identified as Kestrel's primary node was, by the time their first strike arrived, running nothing more important than the lighting in a storage bay full of food containers. Our actual command architecture had been redistributed across 41 different nodes, hardwired in analog backup, coordinated by a relay system that Nina Rourke had designed on a whiteboard in 2 hours and that Colin Shaw had spent 4 days making physically real, with the careful attention to detail he brought to everything he did. The lights went out in the storage bay. Everything else kept working. I did not have time to feel satisfaction about this, because approximately 11 seconds later, the boarding action began, and Defensive Line 4 went from a fortified corridor to the loudest, most complicated place I had ever stood in my life. I am not going to describe that engagement in detail, partly because some of what happened in it is still in restricted files, and partly because the specifics are less important than what the specifics tell you. What I will say is this: the Kelvoran soldiers were tall, faster than I had expected, and carrying weapons that made ours look like they had been assembled from items found at the back of a cupboard. Their combat doctrine was precise. They moved in coordinated patterns that were clearly designed to be mathematically optimal, patterns that covered angles and minimized exposure and communicated information between unit members through a series of signals so subtle that at first we did not even recognize them as signals. They were very good at what they did. The problem was that what they did was what they had always done, and what we did was what we had always done, which was make it up as we went along and argue about it in the middle of doing it and arrive at solutions that made no logical sense and worked anyway because the people on the other side had never had to plan against something that did not follow a pattern. Lena Briggs identified 3 separate tactical decisions in that first engagement that she described afterward as instinctive, meaning she did not think about them before doing them. She just did them because they seemed right, and the time for thinking had passed. 2 of those decisions prevented a breach of the line that would have been very bad. The third one caused a Kelvoran unit to be repositioned in a way that opened a gap in their own coverage, and that gap lasted exactly long enough for us to do something that their formation had no protocol for addressing. Danny Marsh, while all of this was happening, was talking. Not to anyone in particular, not communicating tactical information, just talking in the way he always did, a continuous low commentary on what was happening that somehow managed to be funny at moments when nothing was funny. Flynn, at one point, laughed out loud in the middle of an active exchange, which I think surprised the Kelvoran unit facing him more than anything else that happened in those 26 minutes. The idea that someone would find the situation amusing seemed to require a processing delay that Flynn was happy to use. The Kelvoran soldiers who retreated from defensive line 4 did so in an orderly fashion. They did not break and run. They withdrew in good order, which was professional and correct, and told you something about the quality of their training. But they withdrew, and as they went, I caught a glimpse of the lead soldier's face through the visor of his environmental suit, and what I saw there was not anger and was not fear. It was something I recognized because I had felt it myself, pure, uncomprehending surprise. The expression of someone who had just been shown that the rules of a game they had mastered did not apply in this particular room. They had not expected this. They had not expected any of this. Down in the briefing room, Price was already on a channel with Earth Command, and the report he was receiving, piece by piece, was the same story repeating itself across every point of contact. Humans doing things that made no tactical sense by Kelvoran strategic models, and those things working anyway. Not because they were objectively superior, not because we had better equipment or more resources or a more sophisticated doctrine, but because we were unexpected. Because 15,000 years of unbroken success had produced a military framework of extraordinary precision and zero tolerance for the unscripted. And we were the most aggressively unscripted species that framework had ever encountered. I learned later, through the translated intelligence files that Clara Fenn would work on in the years ahead, that a Kelvoran field commander sent a classified report to the Directorate after the first day of engagement. In it, he described humanity's combat behavior as erratic, internally inconsistent, and resistant to pattern analysis. He noted, with what appeared to be genuine puzzlement, that human soldiers had been observed laughing during active engagements. He could not determine whether this was a cultural stress response or a deliberate psychological tactic. He requested clarification on whether there was existing Directorate research on species that appeared to treat mortal danger as a source of amusement. There was no existing research on this. There was no existing research on us at all. Garrett found me in the corridor after the engagement. I was cleaning my equipment with the careful, mechanical focus that you develop when your hands need something to do and your brain is still catching up with everything that just happened. He sat down beside me on the deck plating, which was not regulation, but neither of us cared, because the alternative was standing, and standing felt like too much. They pulled back, he said. They did, I said. Think they'll come back? Definitely, I said. Right, he was quiet for a moment. He had a bruise forming above his left eye from something that had happened during the engagement that I had not seen, and that he had not mentioned, and that he would not mention unless someone asked directly, which was how he handled most things. Flynn singing in the storage bay. Of course he is. It's actually not bad. It never is. I finished with the equipment. I sat with it in my lap for a moment, looking at the floor. They've never met us before, I said. No, Garrett agreed. They've never met anyone who said no before. No. They built their whole system on the assumption that everyone eventually says yes. He thought about that. That's a fragile thing to build a system on, he said. It is, I said. They just didn't know it yet. I stood up. There was work to do. The day was not close to finished, and we were going to need every hour that remained, because whatever the Kelvoran were doing on the other side of that viewport, it was not resting. They were processing, They were adjusting. They were doing exactly what their 8,000-year military doctrine said to do when the first approach failed, which was apply more pressure in a different form. Flynn's voice carried through the ventilation from the storage bay. He was singing something from home, something familiar without being particular, a melody that anyone from anywhere might have known without being able to name where they first heard it. It was not a sad song. It was not exactly a happy one either. It was the kind of song that belongs to the middle of difficult things, the kind that does not tell you the difficulty is over or that it is going to be easy, but that reminds you, quietly and without making a big point of it, that you have done hard things before and you are still here. The rest of us got back to our posts. Outside the viewport, the Kelvoran fleet held position. 300 ships, patient as doctrine, held by the logic of a protocol that had never failed and a footnote that had never been wrong. The Kelvoran are patient. That is the first thing you need to understand about them. They are patient the way geology is patient, the way distance is patient. They do not hurry. They do not need to hurry, because in 8,000 years they have never encountered a situation that required hurry. The species that refused them were always resolved one way or another within months. The ones that tried to resist burned themselves out against the precision of a military machine that had been calibrated over centuries of exactly this kind of engagement. The ones that did not try to resist signed the protocol and began the long, quiet process of becoming whatever the Kelvoran decided was the appropriate version of them. Neither of those options had occurred to us. And that, more than anything we did in the first weeks of contact, was what confounded them. The second phase of the engagement began on the 21st day, and it was a different kind of thing from the first. Quieter in some ways, more constant in others. The Kelvoran, having recalibrated after the first boarding actions, applied pressure differently. They did not push against our defenses in the same direct way. Instead, they targeted logistics, supply satellites, communication relays, infrastructure on the ground that served civilian as much as military purposes, power stations, water processing networks, transport hubs chosen not for their military value, but for what their disruption would do to the people who depended on them. This was a tactic called, in the translated files, the pressure of certainty. The idea was to make the outcome feel inevitable through accumulated weight, to make the population conclude, gradually and without any single dramatic moment of decision, that continuing to resist was not courage but stubbornness, not principle but pride, and that a sensible people would accept the terms on offer before things got worse. What the Kelvoran had not accounted for was that humanity had been doing something very similar to itself for most of its recorded history, applied by one human power against another, and that we had therefore developed, over a very long time, a particular kind of immunity to that specific pressure. Not immunity in the sense that it did not hurt. It did hurt. The second phase was genuinely hard, and the people on the ground felt every piece of it. But there is a difference between hurt and broken, and the Kelvoran strategic models, which predicted a direct line from one to the other, had never encountered a species for which that line did not run straight. For us, the line did something unexpected. It curved back. Garrett and I monitored the ground-level response feeds when our shifts allowed, and what we saw in those feeds was not the fracturing that the Kelvoran doctrine predicted. Communities that had barely spoken before the war began coordinating without being asked. People with no formal training or registered skills showed up to help with things anyway, and a meaningful number of them turned out to have exactly the relevant skills nobody had thought to put on a registry because nobody had imagined a registry would be needed. A retired engineer in Portugal rebuilt a power relay from components she sourced through 4 separate suppliers, coordinated through a network of people she had never met in person. A group in Cape Town ran a communication node out of a converted garage for 6 weeks without detection. A 14-year-old in Seoul wrote routing software that helped redirect satellite traffic around dead nodes, and the military was using it operationally before anyone got around to checking her age. The Kelvoran were applying pressure to a material they did not understand. They expected it to crack. It compressed instead, and when it compressed, it pushed back. The second surrender protocol arrived on the 31st day. Same channel, same formats, same directorate heading. The terms had changed. The landmass percentage was down to 60. The biological governance clause had been softened in its language, though not in its actual content. The response window had been extended to 96 hours, and the covering note, this time, was not a footnote. It was a full paragraph at the front of the document, placed where it would be read first, which said that the Directorate acknowledged the unexpected resilience of the human response and wished to offer an adjusted arrangement that reflected this resilience in a spirit of mutual respect. Price read it to the assembly. He read the whole paragraph, including the part about mutual respect, which he delivered in exactly the same tone as everything else. Colin Shaw raised his hand. "Sir," he said, "they're saying we've impressed them." "That's the diplomatic reading, yes," Price said. "And they think that's going to make us more likely to sign." "Apparently." Shaw was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone examining a conclusion he found genuinely puzzling. "They really don't understand us at all," he said. He said it without heat, without contempt. As a plain observation, the way you might note that the weather was changing or that a calculation had produced a result different from what the formula suggested. It was a factual statement about a gap in someone's knowledge, nothing more and nothing less. And it was completely accurate. The 96-hour window ran out on a Saturday. We did not send a formal reply. The refusal was communicated by the simple act of continuing to exist and continuing to resist, which was, we had decided, a more complete statement than anything we could put into words. And in a basement in Edinburgh, a linguist named Grace Calloway, who had been working 18-hour days for 6 weeks on the recovered communication files, flagged something that would eventually reach Price, and that Price would relay to us in a briefing that changed the way I understood what we were actually doing here. The Kelvoran had a designation, a specific category in their diplomatic register, applied to species that, when placed under sustained pressure, generated novel and unexpected responses rather than collapsing toward predictable ones. The designation translated as unresolved. In 8,000 years of expansion across the galaxy, across more than 200 contacted civilizations, the Kelvoran Directorate had used that designation exactly once before. Until now. Price told us this. He told us what it meant in terms of their doctrine, what it meant for how they would approach us going forward, and what it meant for us that we had earned that label in fewer than 40 days. Then he looked at the room. "We've been unresolved for 6 weeks," he said. "Let's see how long we can keep it up." Flynn made tea. We got back to work. "I want to tell you about the bridge. Not because it is the most important thing that happened in the 3rd year of the war, because it is not. The most important things happened elsewhere, in places I was not, and in decisions made by people with more authority and broader vision than I had at the time. But the bridge is the thing I understand best, because I was there for all 11 days of it, and because what happened there is, in small form, what happened everywhere during that period. It is the story of the cost, and if I am going to be honest with you, and I intend to be, I cannot tell you about what we achieved without telling you what we lost to achieve it. But first you need to know what the year before the bridge looked like, because the bridge does not make sense without it. The Kelvoran second phase, the Pressure of Certainty campaign, had run for 4 months. 4 months of targeted infrastructure strikes, of supply disruptions, of carefully chosen targets designed to accumulate weight rather than deliver a decisive blow. The Kelvoran doctrine in this phase was not to win quickly, it was to win inevitably. To create the sense, day by day and loss by loss, that the direction of things could not be changed, only accepted or delayed. What they got instead was the thing I described before, compression rather than fracture, communities pulling tighter rather than pulling apart, innovation from places and people that no strategic model would have predicted. And a civilian population that was tired, genuinely tired, and that dealt with the tiredness not by looking for an exit, but by looking for something useful to do, which is a very human response to a very human problem, and one that the Kelvoran, who had never had to calculate for it, simply did not have in their models. By the end of the second phase, the Kelvoran had burned resources they had not planned on burning. They had extended their engagement timeline by a factor that their directorate had not anticipated. They had transmitted 2 surrender protocols and received, in return, a silence that their analysts could not correctly interpret, because the silence of a species that has considered your offer and declined it completely looks identical, from the outside, to the silence of a species that is still deciding. The Kelvoran kept waiting for us to still be deciding. We had already decided. We were just busy. The third phase began with a ground war that I want to be careful describing, not because I want to spare you the reality of it, but because I want to spare myself the temptation to make it simpler than it was. Ground wars are not simple. They are not the version of conflict that works well as a story, because the thing that makes them difficult is exactly the thing that makes them hard to communicate: the length. The sustained grinding of days and weeks and months of holding and advancing and being pushed back and holding again. The way time works differently when every day is fundamentally like the last one, except for the specific, unrepeatable ways in which it is worse. My unit had been reassigned from Kestrel to ground operations 2 months into the third phase, following a restructuring of orbital defense that freed up experienced personnel for the locations where the ground engagement was heaviest. It was the right call. I understood why it was made. I missed Kestrel with an intensity that surprised me, because the station had been cold and rationed and difficult, and what I missed was not the comfort, which had been minimal, but the people. Flynn and Briggs and Rourke and Shaw and Garrett and Mars, redistributed now across 6 different assignments, reachable when the communication relays allowed it, and sometimes not even then. I got letters from Flynn. They were long and cheerful and only occasionally about the war, which was exactly right. I got short, precise updates from Rourke. I got a book recommendation from Shaw that took me 3 months to act on, and that I am glad I eventually did. My new unit was good. I want to be clear about that. They were good at their work and good people to stand beside, and I was glad to serve with them. Corporal Alicia Nair from Birmingham, 28 years old, 7 years with the Corps, the best soldier I served with during the ground campaign, and I will not qualify that statement. Private Theo Barker, 24, tall and quietly inventive, who had a gift for solving logistical problems from resources he described only as around, and who always delivered. Private Sam Elliott, 19 years old, the youngest in the unit, who dealt with the particular weight of his situation by keeping count of things, a habit I came to understand as one of the most functional coping mechanisms I observed in 4 years of war. And Private Cora Dean, 26, from a coastal city in Scotland, who had trained as a field medic before joining the Corps and who had the specific quality of medical professionals in conflict situations. An absolute focus on the immediate and practical that somehow coexisted with a comprehensive awareness of everything else. The bridge assignment came with 6 hours of notice. I was told we needed to hold it for 24 hours, possibly 36, until a larger force could be repositioned to take over the crossing defense. The bridge spanned a river valley in a mountainous region that was strategically significant not for any single asset it contained, but for the network of supply routes that ran through it. The crossing was one of 4 intact bridges remaining over the river at that point. Losing it would make 3 defensive positions on the eastern side of the valley untenable within 2 days. So it had to be held, and we were the unit available to hold it. We held it for 11 days. I will not give you the days in sequence because the sequence is not the point, and because several of those days are not something I can move through in an orderly way without losing the thread of what I actually want to tell you, What I will give you is the shape of it. The first day was the kind of day that you understand how to do. The Kelvoran ground units pushed the crossing from two directions simultaneously, one anticipated and one not, and we adapted, and the adaptation cost us. Corporal Pete Harlow, who had been with the Corps for 4 years and who had a gift for making briefings easier to sit through, did not survive the first day. He was replaced, in the unit's functional structure, by reassignment. He was not replaced in any other sense. He does not get a footnote here. He gets a sentence, which is not enough, but it is what I have. The second and third days were adjustment. Learning how the Kelvoran unit we were facing operated, what their patterns were, where the gaps in their approach were. Alicia led this process with the systematic thoroughness she brought to every problem, building a working model of their behavior from the data of each engagement and updating it in the hours between. By the end of the third day, she could predict their next move about 60% of the time, which was not enough to rely on, but was enough to be useful. The fourth day was when we found out the larger force had been delayed. The fifth day was when we found out it had been delayed again. By then we understood that the 36-hour estimate had been made on the basis of information that had since changed substantially, and that we were going to be holding this crossing for considerably longer than anyone had planned. This was a thing that happens in wars, and the appropriate response to it is to stop calculating how much longer and start calculating what you have to work with. Theo worked the supply problem. He was, as I have said, inventive, and around turned out to mean several things that I will not detail because some of them are officially irregular and some of them involve people and places that should remain unofficial. The point is that we did not run out of what we needed to run on, which in a sustained defensive position is the difference between holding and not holding. Sam kept count on the concrete wall of the maintenance shelter at the south end of the bridge. He counted things that mattered: water consumed per person per day, sleep hours logged by each unit member, rounds remaining in each weapon system. He updated the count every 6 hours, marking the wall with a precision that would have seemed excessive if you did not understand what it was doing, which was making the situation feel bounded, countable, something that had a number and that therefore had a limit and that therefore could be managed. Cora Dean worked continuously. There is no other way to say it. She worked with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that what is in front of her is enough to think about, and that what is beyond her immediate capacity does not need to be decided right now, and that right now is always where the important work is happening. She was very good at her work. She is the reason that the unit's numbers did not get worse than they did. The Kelvoran pushed the crossing 7 times over 11 days, 7 distinct engagements, each one different from the last, because their unit was learning from us the same way we were learning from them. The early engagements had a quality of pattern to them, their standard pacification doctrine applied to a defensive position, and those patterns were the ones Alicia mapped and worked against. The later engagements were less patterned, more responsive, which told us something important. The Kelvoran unit we were facing was capable of adaptation. They were not just running the playbook, they were trying to figure us out. That was, in a specific way, encouraging. It was encouraging because it meant that we were not something their playbook could handle, which meant we were doing what we were supposed to be doing, which meant the bridge was costing them something too, not just in the tactical sense but in the broader sense. The same way every engagement that produced an unexpected result was costing the Kelvoran something that had nothing to do with resources or territory. It was costing them their certainty. Day 7 was the worst day. I am going to tell you that, and nothing else about it, because some things you carry in a way that does not improve from being described in detail. What happened on Day 7 stays in Day 7. The unit got through it. Not cleanly, but through it. Day 8 was when Theo produced the radio receiver. He had assembled it from components he declined to fully account for in the spare hours of a night shift when the crossing had been quiet. It was not in our equipment manifest. It was not technically authorized. It worked, and on the evening of Day 8, through that receiver, We picked up a fragment of the Kelvoran strategic command frequency, imperfect and partially corrupted, but legible to someone who knew the language. Cora knew the language, not fluently, not even close to fluently, but she had been working from a translation guide during the quiet hours of the campaign in the same way that other people work through problems, by learning the parts of the language that directly touched her work. She had been tracking Kelvoran medical terminology, of all things, because understanding how their systems described casualties and medical events had occasionally given her advance information about the shape of an engagement before it fully developed. She was precise about what she was confident of and what she was not, which is the only way to use imperfect information without letting it become dangerous. What she translated from the fragment, slowly, with careful qualifications, was this: the Kelvoran Directorate had convened an internal review. The review concerned the handling of the human engagement. The specific phrase she was most confident about was one from the Directorate's diplomatic register. She had seen it before, in material circulated from the Edinburgh team. It referred to the designation for species that, when placed under pressure, generated novel and unexpected responses rather than collapsing toward predictable ones. The designation she translated, carefully, with a small and exhausted smile, was unresolved. They were still using it. After 3 years of war, after 2 surrender protocol transmissions, after a ground campaign that had cost both sides enormously, after everything that the Pressure of Certainty campaign was supposed to produce, after all of it, we were still unresolved. Alicia Nair heard the translation. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the count on the wall, the tally of water and sleep and rounds that Sam kept updated every 6 hours. She looked at the river below the bridge, dark in the evening light, moving without acknowledgement of anything that happened above it. "Good," she said. One word, no decoration, the exact and sufficient response to the situation. On the morning of day 11, the larger force arrived. It came down the western road before sunrise, 3 times our number, with equipment and supplies that made our 11-day inventory look like what it was. We walked back through the early morning while they were still establishing position, single file, down the narrow road that wound through the valley toward the forward staging area. The mountains on both sides were the particular shade before full light, blue-gray and still. Nobody spoke much, because there was nothing that needed saying that the walk did not say better. Sam Elliott had the count on a folded piece of paper in his chest pocket. He did not look at it while he walked. He did not need to. He had been tracking it for 11 days, and he knew every number on it, the way you know things you have spent a long time looking at. At the staging area, a message was waiting for me from Nina Rourke, 300 kilometers away, in a role I was not fully briefed on. Her messages were always short. This one said, "Third protocol offer this morning. Down to 45% land. Response window open-ended. No deadline." I stood with the message for a long time. Open-ended. No deadline. The first protocol had a 72-hour window. The second had 96 hours. The third had no deadline at all. The Kelvoran, who operated on the logic that certainty was a weapon and time was a tool of that weapon, had stopped setting a deadline, which meant they were no longer certain of the outcome. Which meant the certainty that had underwritten the entire protocol strategy, the fundamental assumption that pressure plus time equals surrender, was beginning to look, inside the Kelvoran Directorate, less like a law of nature and more like an assumption that had encountered a counterexample. We were the counterexample. I wrote back to Roark. I wrote, "We heard about the review. How bad is it for them?" She replied 2 days later. The reply said, "Bad enough. Keep going." There is a specific kind of clarity that comes from being told something you already know, not new information, not a strategic update, just a confirmation that the understanding you have developed from the inside matches what is visible from a broader vantage point. Rourke's message was that kind of clarity. Bad enough and keep going. 11 words that contained everything necessary and nothing unnecessary, which was exactly how she communicated everything. We kept going. The third phase of the ground war continued for 7 more months after the bridge. I moved through 3 different unit assignments in that period, as the restructuring of the ground campaign continued to redistribute experienced personnel to the points of highest pressure. Each assignment was different in its specifics and the same in its essential shape: a defensive or recovery position that needed holding, people who needed working with and learning from, and occasionally arguing with in ways that were productive, and the daily, grinding, undramatic work of not losing what needed to be held. I want to be clear about something. The third phase of the war did not feel, from the inside, like the turning point that it became in the analysis written afterward. Turning points almost never feel like turning points when you are living inside them. They feel like sustained difficulty that is not clearly different from the sustained difficulty before it. The sense of direction that I described earlier, the shift from something happening to us towards something we were doing, did not arrive in a single moment. It accumulated the way the months accumulated, gradually, without announcement, becoming visible only when you looked back from enough distance to see the whole shape of it. What I can tell you is that by the end of the third phase, 3 things were true that had not been true at the beginning of the war. The Kelvoran had a third entry in their diplomatic register's terminal anomaly category. There had been 2 before us in 8,000 years, and both of them had eventually resulted in the Directorate reclassifying the contested space and withdrawing. We had earned the same designation. We would later confirm this from the recovered files, but we did not know it yet, at the end of the third phase. We suspected it. The Galactic Council of Species, which we had known existed in a theoretical sense, but had not had direct contact with, had begun routing quiet signals through channels that our communications team had identified but not yet fully decoded. Something was shifting at the broader level of galactic politics. The existence of a species that had refused the protocol for 3 years and was still refusing it was producing effects beyond the immediate military engagement. We did not know the shape of those effects yet. But the signals were there, and the Kelvoran third protocol offer was still open. No deadline, no escalation, just an offer sitting in space, waiting for a response that was never going to come in the form they were waiting for. That offer, sitting open and unanswered, was the most accurate measure I had of where things stood. The Kelvoran did not leave things open-ended. They operated on timelines and certainties and the clean, bureaucratic logic of processes that had always resolved. An open-ended offer meant an unresolved situation. It meant that the Directorate, for the first time in 8,000 years, did not know what came next. Neither did we, fully. But we were about to find out. I received my transfer orders to the naval deployment 6 weeks after the bridge. I packed what I had, which was not much, and I said the necessary goodbyes, and I went up to the ISV Obstinate, which was waiting in orbit with a crew that had already been told something of what we were going to be doing and that had, apparently, voted on the ship's name in a process that was unauthorized but effective. I had been aboard exactly 3 hours when I ran into Garrett in the corridor. He had been there for 3 weeks already. He looked the same and different in the way that people look after a long time apart, when you see both the version of them you remembered and the version that has accumulated new experience in the interval. He met me with his usual careful expression and then broke it slightly, which was his version of saying he was glad. "You look terrible," he said. "Thank you," I said. "How was the bridge?" "Long," I said. He nodded. He understood long. "Come on," he said. "There's something you need to hear." I followed him down the corridor toward the analysis bay, and what he told me on the way was the beginning of the next part of the story, the part where we stopped holding and started moving, where we stopped being something the Kelvoran were doing something to, and started being something the Kelvoran needed to start worrying about in a different way. But I will get to that. First, I want you to sit with the bridge for a moment. With 11 days, an account on a wall, and a radio receiver assembled from around, and a word from a woman who said exactly enough and nothing more. With Pete Harlow, who did not see any of what came next. With what it costs to be the kind of people who say no when yes is the option that does not cost anything. The cost was real. It did not make us doubt the refusal, but it was real, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than folded into the part of the story where things start going well. Things started going well, but first, the bridge. The ISV Obstinate was a real ship, and its name was really voted on. I want to be clear about this, because it is the kind of detail that sounds like it has been added for effect, and it has not. The crew submitted names through an informal process that Lieutenant Commander Petra Vance described in her initial briefing as unauthorized but effective, which was also how she described most things she quietly approved of. The shortlist had included several names that Command had flagged as inappropriate for an official naval vessel. Obstinate was the one everyone agreed on. It was, the crew felt, accurate. Petra was 42 years old, sharp-eyed and precise in the way of someone who had long since decided which rules existed for good reasons and which ones existed out of habit, and had organized her professional life accordingly. She was not casual about it. She was deliberate about it, which is a very different thing. She ran the ship's informal processes with the same attention she gave the official ones, because she understood that the informal processes were where most of the real work happened, and that pretending otherwise was a form of willful blindness that she did not have time for. The Obstinate's captain was Gregory Holt, 53 years old, lean and unhurried, with the manner of someone who had thought very carefully about what actually mattered in a crisis, and had discarded everything else as noise. He did not hold unnecessary meetings. He did not give unnecessary orders. He trusted his crew in a specific way, not by hovering to verify that they were doing the right things, but by hiring people he trusted and then leaving them alone to do the right things. The crew responded to this by being, as far as I observed, extremely reluctant to let him down. My role on the Obstinate was as part of an insertion team. We were not the kind of military asset that takes territory or holds ground. We went in fast, retrieved what we needed, and came back before we became a problem for the people who would have to deal with the consequences of us being caught. The thing we were retrieving was information. The Kelvoran supply lines, stretched now across the considerable distance between their staging zones and Earth system, were threaded with logistics stations, relay platforms, and coordination nodes that communicated constantly with each other and with the Directorate, and that contained, in their files, a detailed picture of how the Kelvoran war effort was actually functioning versus how it was meant to be functioning. We were reading them, not destroying them, in most cases, because a destroyed station told the Kelvoran immediately that something had gone wrong. A station that appeared to be functioning normally while quietly missing some of its data told them nothing, which was considerably more useful to us. Garrett was embedded in the intelligence analysis team, which was exactly the right place for him and which he had settled into with the comfortable assurance of someone who had found the work that fitted him. He met me at the docking bay when I came aboard, and he had the expression he wore when he was glad to see someone and was deciding how obvious to be about it. We walked to my assigned quarters, and he told me, on the way, what the team had found in the files from the last 3 stations. The Kelvoran classification system. It was, he explained, a straightforward bureaucratic mechanism, the kind of administrative structure that any large organization develops for managing its active cases. The Directorate classified every contacted species into one of 3 categories. The first was pending, a species that had been contacted and had not yet responded to the protocol, or that was in the response window. The second was resolved, a species that had accepted the protocol and was under supervised continuance. The third, the one he was getting to, came in 2 forms. The first form was what they called a suspended case, a species that had initially refused the protocol and had subsequently been pacified by escalated engagement. 41 suspended cases across 8,000 years. The species still existed in all 41 cases, operating under the protocol terms, no longer classified as unresolved. The second form was what they called a terminal anomaly, a species that had refused the protocol and had proven impossible to pacify by escalated engagement, resulting in the Directorate reclassifying the regional space as contested and withdrawing. 3 terminal anomalies in 8,000 years. All 3 species were still out there, small and isolated, in regions that the Kelvoran had marked as contested and never returned to. 3 in 8,000 years. What happened to them? I said. The 3 terminal anomalies. They survived, Garrett said. Clara found references in the files. The Kelvoran never went back. They designated the space contested and moved on to easier targets. We need to become the 4th, I said. We're working on it, he said. I thought about what that meant in terms of what we were doing on the Obstinate. Every station we read, every file we recovered, every piece of the Kelvoran operational picture that we moved from their knowledge to ours was contributing to something larger than the immediate intelligence value. We were demonstrating, raid by raid, that we could go places the Kelvoran had not planned for us to go. That we could operate at a range and with a persistence that their strategic models had not anticipated from a species that was, by any objective measure, considerably younger and smaller and less resourced than they were. We were being, in the specific Kelvoran designation, unresolvable. Captain Holt received the information about the classification system the evening I arrived. He listened without interruption, standing at the forward viewport of the Obstinate with his hands behind his back, looking at nothing in particular, which was what he looked like when he was thinking most carefully. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "How confident is Clara in the translation?" he said. "Very," I said. "Garrett verified her work independently." He nodded. He kept looking at the viewport. "Then we need to find the station with the active case files," he said. "The current classification log. If they've moved us from unresolved to either suspended or terminal anomaly, I want to know which one, before anyone else does." "And if it's suspended?" I asked. He turned from the viewport. His expression was as even and unhurried as always. "Then we change their assessment," he said. Petra Vance's plan for Station Relay 7 was 12 pages long. It involved 4 teams, 3 of which were decoys, and 1 of which was actually going in. I was on the 4th team. The preparation took 9 days, the approach took 3, and the operation itself lasted 47 minutes, of which approximately 11 were spent doing what we had come to do, and the rest were spent in various forms of managed urgency that I will describe only as consistent with the kind of work this was. We came back with the files. Clara Fenn was in the analysis bay when we docked. She had been there, by the look of her, for most of the 9 days of preparation and all of the 3 days of approach, running comparisons on the previously recovered files and building the translation framework that would let her read the new material quickly. She was 28 years old, from a city in the English Midlands, and she had the quality of a person who genuinely loves their work in a way that is not diminished by the difficulty of it. She worked the way some people run long distances, with her attention turned entirely inward, processing, and a peripheral awareness of everything around her that was sufficient but not distracting. She came to find me in my bunk at 0300. She had the look of someone who had not slept and did not care because she had something better to hold on to than sleep. "They reclassified us," she said. I was awake immediately. Fully, cleanly, with no transition. "Which category?" I said. She smiled. It was a tired smile, but underneath the tiredness, it was the real thing, unambiguous. "Terminal anomaly," she said. I sat up. "When?" I said. 6 weeks ago," she said, "before the 3rd protocol offer. They sent the offer and reclassified us at the same time." I sat with that for a moment. "The offer wasn't a sign that they thought we might still sign," I said. "No," she said. "The offer is a procedural requirement, When a species is reclassified as a terminal anomaly, the Directorate transmits a final offer as a formal record that the process was completed correctly. Then, if the offer is declined, the regional space gets designated contested and they begin withdrawal planning. "And we haven't formally declined the third offer," I said. "We haven't responded at all, and they haven't set a deadline, so they're waiting for a response that confirms the reclassification." "Yes." "And if we never send one?" She thought about that. "The files don't describe that scenario," she said. "I don't think it's occurred to them as a possibility." I got dressed. I told her to wake Garrett. We went down to the analysis bay, and I spent the next 3 hours with Clara and Garrett and the translated files, building the picture of where we actually stood and what it meant for what we did next. What it meant was this. The Kelvoran had already, in their own internal record-keeping, conceded. Not publicly, not in a way that any other species could see, but in the file that mattered most, the one that would determine how they moved forward, they had written us into the category that meant, "We cannot resolve this. We will reclassify the space and withdraw." And they were waiting, with their third offer open and their withdrawal planning presumably underway, for us to confirm the reclassification by declining the offer in some formal way. Once we did that, the process was complete. The file closed. The space was designated contested. They moved on. We had a choice about when that happened, and the longer we waited to formally respond, the longer their withdrawal planning existed in a state of procedural limbo, which was uncomfortable for them and information-rich for us. I told Holt in the morning. He listened with the same stillness he always brought to significant information, and then he called Petra and the senior team, and we sat around the planning table and talked about what the next phase looked like. The raids continued. We hit 5 more stations over the following 2 months. The intelligence picture we were building was detailed enough, by that point, that Clara and her team could map the Kelvoran operational structure with a clarity that our strategic planners found genuinely useful. We knew where the resources were being distributed. We knew where the internal pressure within the Directorate was building. We knew which of the Kelvoran field commanders were arguing for withdrawal and which were arguing for continued engagement and which were doing neither because they had already reached the conclusion that neither option had a clean outcome. I was part of the team on Station Relay 12 when we found something that none of us had been looking for. The station's communication archive contained a series of transmissions between the Directorate and the Galactic Council of Species. The Galactic Council was the broader governance body, the one that the Kelvoran had largely shaped over the centuries of their expansion, but that was not, technically, their organization alone. It included representatives from a range of species, most of them under protocol supervision, some of them not. The transmissions were formal and carefully worded in the way of communications between powerful parties that are discussing something neither of them entirely controls. What they described, translated by Clara over the following week, was a growing pressure from the Council on the Directorate to pursue a negotiated resolution to the human engagement, rather than continuing to seek a military outcome. The pressure was coming from 2 directions. One was practical. The cost of the engagement had exceeded Directorate projections by a factor that was beginning to produce political friction within the Directorate itself. The extended campaign, the failed protocol transmissions, the unresolved designation, all of it was sitting on the record in a way that was difficult to explain to a body that had been told, consistently, that the protocol process was reliable and final. The other direction was more interesting. Something had shifted in the Galactic Council beyond the practical. The existence of a species that had refused the protocol for 3 years and was still refusing it, that had been reclassified as a terminal anomaly but had not gone quietly into that reclassification, was producing conversations in the Council that had not happened before. Not publicly, not in any official capacity, but the signals were there, in the archive of the Directorate's communications, in the careful language of diplomatic parties that are beginning to say something they have not said before. Clara translated one particular message from a council member species that she read to Holt and Petra and me in the analysis bay, with the care she gave to anything she wanted to be understood precisely. The message said, in effect, that the human engagement had introduced a question into the council's proceedings that had not previously existed. The question was whether the protocol, as designed and as applied, was consistent with the foundational principles of the Council's own charter. The question had not been formally raised as a motion. It was being discussed informally, in the way that things that are too significant to ignore and too complicated to address quickly tend to be discussed, carefully, with increasing frequency, and with a seriousness that suggested it was not going away. Holt read the translation twice. Then he set it down. "They're questioning the protocol itself," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "Not just our engagement, the whole system. That's what it says." He was quiet for a long time. "Then we need to be at the table when that conversation becomes formal," he said. "We need to make sure that when this moves from informal to official, humanity's perspective is on record." I thought about the footnote in the original protocol document. No contacted species had ever declined. We had declined. We had held the bridge and rebuilt the power relays and assembled radio receivers from around and made tea in cold corridors and counted water and sleep and rounds on a concrete wall. We had done all of it, and it had added up, slowly and without a clear moment of arrival, to something that was now large enough to be visible from space. There was a message waiting for me when we returned from Station Relay 12. It was addressed to me specifically, by name, which was unusual enough that several members of the communications team flagged it before routing it to my terminal. It was from the Kelvoran Directorate. Not a protocol transmission, not a formal diplomatic communication. It was addressed to me, Cale Morrow, Marine of the Earth Defense Corps, in the manner of a personal communication, which the Kelvoran had never sent to an individual human before. The message noted that my name had appeared in several Directorate intelligence summaries in connection with specific engagements. It asked, in formal Kelvoran diplomatic language, whether I would be prepared to describe the human reasoning process as it related to the original refusal of the protocol. I read it 3 times. I showed it to Holt. He read it once. "It's a psychological tactic," he said. "They want to find the individual logic and understand it so they can address it." "I know," I said. "What do you want to do?" I thought about it. I had a notebook. I had carried it through Kestrel, and through the ground campaign, and through the bridge, through the transfer to the Obstinate, and 3 months of raids. I wrote things in it when I wanted to think through something on paper rather than in my head. I got the notebook out. I wrote a reply. I wrote it in plain English, by hand, and I told Garrett to scan it and translate it and transmit it in the formal Kelvoran diplomatic register. The reply was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph addressed their question about human reasoning, and the answer was not complicated. We had refused because the thing being offered was not acceptable, and the cost of accepting it was not the kind of cost that could be made up later. The second paragraph noted, plainly, that if the Directorate was interested in a different kind of conversation, one with a different format and a different likely outcome, we were prepared to participate in one. The reply caused a minor diplomatic incident in the Directorate's internal communications. Clara found evidence of this incident 3 weeks later, in the files from Station Relay 14. The incident was not about the content of the reply. It was about the second paragraph, specifically, the phrase, "a different kind of conversation." The Kelvoran diplomatic register did not contain a direct equivalent for this phrase. The translator assigned to the message had rendered it as accurately as the register allowed, but the rendering had produced a sentence that the Directorate's senior diplomatic staff found ambiguous in a way that required a 2-day internal discussion to resolve. The conclusion they reached was that we were indicating willingness to engage in a process leading toward a formal resolution. They were right. We had been working toward that conclusion for 4 years. The bridge, The orbital stations, the raids, the tea in the cold corridors, the count on the wall. All of it had been building toward the thing that the Kelvoran, finally, were beginning to understand was the only outcome available. Not a surrender, not a protocol, not a supervised continuance. A conversation with a different format and a different likely outcome. Which was coming. The Peace Summit was held on a neutral orbital platform that neither side had built, operated by a species called the Vreth, in a region of space that had been designated neutral by a convention so old that neither the Kelvoran nor anyone else remembered who had drafted it. The platform was clean and precise in the way that spaces maintained by careful neutral parties always are, every surface calibrated for function, every detail chosen with the understanding that the people who would use the space were bringing their own considerable freight of significance and did not need the architecture adding to it. I need to tell you about the Vreth before I tell you about the summit, because they matter more than the public record of the war ever gave them credit for. The Vreth had been under Kelvoran protection for 600 years. Protection is the Kelvoran word for it. The Vreth had other words for it, words that Clara Fenn translated with careful neutrality, and that meant something closer to administered. They were a quiet people, technically sophisticated, with a social structure built around patience and long-term thinking in a way that made their 600 years under Kelvoran supervision something they had endured by treating it as a temporary condition, even when temporary stretched across multiple generations. They had maintained, during all of that time, a set of intelligence archives about the Kelvoran that were extraordinarily detailed, organized with the systematic thoroughness of people who understood that information is the one resource that does not run out if you manage it carefully. They had been waiting for someone to demonstrate that the protocol could be refused. Garrett made contact with them first, through the signals work he had been doing on the Obstinate. The initial contact was indirect, routed through relay systems in a format that took 3 days to fully decode, and what it said was simple. The Vreth knew what the Kelvoran files said about us. They wanted to talk. Over the following months, through a secure channel that Garrett and a Vreth communications engineer called Res established between them, we learned the shape of what the Vreth knew. The Galactic Council was real and functioning, and had been watching our engagement with the Kelvoran with a quality of attention that was not casual. 214 species had signed the protocol over 8,000 years. Most of them were still operating under its terms. Many of them had been living under those terms for long enough that the terms had come to feel like geography, like the shape of the land, permanent and unchosen and simply there. The idea that it could be different was not something most of them had space to hold, because the evidence that it was otherwise had, until now, been absent. We were the evidence. The Vreth proposed the format for the summit, working through the Galactic Council. They proposed it because they understood the procedural language better than we did, and because having a species that was already under the Council's framework make the proposal gave it a legitimacy that a proposal from humanity, which was still technically outside that framework, would not have had. The Council accepted the proposal. The Kelvoran accepted it for the reasons I described. The terminal anomaly reclassification had created a political situation inside the Directorate that required resolution, and a mediated process was cleaner than continued engagement with a species that had proven non-pacifiable. We accepted it because 4 years of war had cost us things we could not get back, and the classification we had needed to earn was earned, and continuing to fight past the point where negotiation was possible would have made all of it cost more without producing more. Price made the decision. He was the right person to make it. He had been in the room from the beginning. His conditions were 4: full sovereignty, no protocol, mutual non-aggression, open trade terms, and an apology. The apology was the one that generated the most discussion, internally and among our own council members. Several people argued that it was not strategically necessary, that it would not change anything material, that the Kelvoran might refuse it, and that its absence from the final agreement would be used as a symbolic point against us by people who were inclined to find such points. Price said that was not the point. He said the point was the record. He said that what happened to us deserved to be named in the permanent account of what had occurred, and that an acknowledgement sitting in the preamble of the agreement was the only way to make that naming official, permanent, and attributable to the people who owed it. He said this without drama, as a plain statement of what he believed, in the same register he used for tactical briefings and personnel reassignments and everything else. And when he was done, the people in the room who had been arguing against the apology had run out of things to say, because they had been arguing against it on practical grounds, and he had just explained that it was not a practical matter, and they did not have a counter-argument to that. The summit room was circular. The Vreth had designed it that way deliberately. No head, no position of authority, a table with no end. The lighting had been calibrated through a process of consultation that I understood had been technically complex, because the visual systems of the species present were different enough that a light level comfortable for one delegation was too bright or too dim for another. The compromise left it slightly brighter than I would have chosen. I did not complain about this. There were 12 people in the room on the human side, including Price and several council representatives whose names you know from the official record. I was there as part of what the official documentation describes as operational advisory personnel, which was the formal category that covered the informal reality of my being there, because of what I had written in the margins of a protocol document 3 years earlier, a note that had caused a minor diplomatic incident and that the Kelvoran had apparently continued to find interesting. High Director Venn was across the table. The field commander who had sent the report describing human soldiers laughing during combat, who had requested clarification on whether this was a stress response or a tactic. I had read that report in the translated files. I knew what he had thought of us in those first days. Sitting across from him now, in a room where the outcome of 8,000 years of expansion was being renegotiated in a format that had no predecessor in the Directorate's archives, I found that I was less interested in what he had thought of us and more interested in what he was thinking now. He was still, very still, the stillness of someone who has reorganized a great deal of certainty and is holding the new arrangement with care. The negotiation ran for 6 days. I will not walk you through all of it. Most of what happened in that room was technical and procedural, the kind of careful, intricate work that produces documents which look simple once they are finished, and which conceal, in their simplicity, the enormous amount of precisely managed difficulty that went into producing them. Price's team was good. The Kelvoran delegation was professional. The Vreth representatives who facilitated the process were excellent, in a way that suggested they had been preparing for this specific task for a very long time, which they had. On the second day, Price raised the apology. He raised it formally, in the diplomatic language that Clara had helped him calibrate for the context. He said that humanity was requesting a formal acknowledgement from the Kelvoran Directorate that the application of the Mercy Clause to a civilization that had not requested it was an error of judgment that caused measurable harm, and that this acknowledgement should appear in the written record of the agreement. The lead Kelvoran negotiator, a small and precise individual named something that rendered in our language as Curator Amal, was quiet for a long time. Then she said that the Directorate was prepared to acknowledge that the application of the protocol, in this instance, had produced outcomes inconsistent with the protocol's stated purpose. Price said that was not an apology. Amal said it was the closest available formulation within the existing Kelvoran diplomatic register. Price said that was interesting, and that he was prepared to wait while the delegation expanded the available formulations. There was a recess. It ran for 4 hours. When the session resumed, High Director Venn spoke for the first time. He spoke directly to Price, not through the translation system, in the careful English that the Kelvoran had developed over the course of the war. And Clara, beside me, was still enough that I understood she was listening with her full attention and did not want to miss anything. He said, We have encountered 312 civilizations. All previous protocol applications were resolved. This one was not. We did not anticipate this. We should have anticipated this. He paused. The room was very quiet. He said, "We regret the harm caused." Amal looked at him. The other members of the Kelvoran delegation looked at him. From the quality of their attention, I understood that this had not been planned. This had not been agreed in advance. This was Ven making a decision, in the moment, about what was accurate and what was owed. Price accepted it with a quiet nod, not celebratory, not diminishing, a nod that said, "I received what you said, it is on the record, and we can move forward now." He had the understanding, which not everyone in his position would have had, that the point of the apology was not to make the other side feel small. The point was to make it real. To put it where it could not be taken back. The final agreement was signed on the 6th day. Full sovereignty, confirmed and codified. The protocol declared void as applied to any civilization operating under the principles of the new agreement. Mutual non-aggression, with a framework for trade that would be the basis of the negotiations that came after, and the apology, worded as Ven had spoken it, placed in the preamble where it would be read by anyone who read anything that followed. Open trade terms, which had been our 4th condition, we did not fully achieve in the form we had asked for. The framework we accepted was narrower than we wanted, and it has since been renegotiated on 2 occasions, and what is in place now is considerably better than what we signed. These things take time. I accepted this at the time, and I accept it now. What we also got, which had not been in our list of conditions because we had not known to ask for it, was something that came from outside the negotiation entirely. The Saul Addendum. Rest told Garrett about it on the evening of the 5th day, when the agreement was in its final stages of drafting and the Vreth had shifted their attention from the process of the summit to what came next. The addendum was a formal proposal to the Galactic Council, submitted by the Vreth on the same day the peace agreement was completed. It was a single clause, added to the Council's foundational charter. The clause stated that the Kelvoran Mercy Clause, and any equivalent instrument produced by any member species, could only be legitimately applied to a contacted civilization upon that civilization's request, and that the refusal of such an instrument must be acknowledged, respected, and recorded without further military consequence. The right to say no. The simplest possible formulation of a thing that had, for 8,000 years, been treated as though it did not exist. The Galactic Council voted on it during the same period that the final agreement documents were being formalized. The vote passed, not without complexity. There were abstentions and objections, and the kind of procedural difficulty that large bodies produce when they are doing something that has no established precedent. But it passed. And afterward, through the Vreth channel, Rest told Garrett that 3 species that had abstained for internal political reasons had sent private communications indicating that the abstentions were temporary and that the situation was developing. They were watching. Everyone was watching. I was in the observation corridor of the Vreth platform on the last evening of the summit, after the signing, when Ven came and stood beside me. The corridor had Vreth-style transparent paneling along its full length, facing away from the nearest sun, looking out at the part of space where darkness is not empty but full of things too distant to distinguish individually. It was the kind of view that reminds you of the scale of everything, in a way that is uncomfortable when you are small and somehow appropriate when you have just done something that is going to matter at that scale. He did not speak for a while. I did not either. The silence between us was not the silence of 2 people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people who have a great deal to say and are deciding whether any of it needs to be said aloud. After a time, he spoke in Kelvoran. Then he stopped himself and spoke in English. He said, "We have a phrase in our language. The translation is approximate. The phrase refers to a thing that was believed to be fixed, a property of how reality works, and that was then demonstrated to be only a belief. The moment of that demonstration is described by the phrase, We have used it for 8,000 years to refer to discoveries in mathematics and in the structure of space." He looked at the stars. He said, "We have now used it, for the first time, to refer to a species." I looked at him. He said, "It is not a comfortable thing to discover that something you believe to be a law was only an assumption. But it is, in the end, a correct thing. A thing that is true is better to know than a thing that is not true, even when the true thing is more complicated." He was quiet again for a moment. He said, "Your people are confusing to us. We do not expect this to change." Then he turned and walked back down the corridor, at his even and unhurried pace, back toward the session rooms and the documentation and the long administrative work of making the agreement real in all the ways that agreements need to be made real before they become actual rather than just signed. I stood at the viewport for a long time after he left. I thought about the footnote, 61 pages of certainty resting on the assumption that no species would refuse, and underneath all of it, that footnote, no contacted species had ever declined, presented not as a claim about the future, but as a description of the past. The past is not an argument. The past is just what has happened, and what has happened can always be added to. I thought about Flynn making tea in a cold corridor, and the kettle being not regulation equipment and nobody caring. I thought about Danny Marsh talking in the dark, so the rest of us did not retreat too far into our own heads. I thought about Pete Harlow, who did not see any of this, and about all the others who did not see it, and about what it means to carry people who cannot be here in the record they helped make. I thought about Alicia Nair saying good in the flat and exact way of someone who needed exactly one word. I thought about Sam Elliott's count on the wall, and Cora Dean's focused and continuous work, and Theo Barker's around, and Colin Shaw's books in his chest pocket, and Lena Briggs's reflexes that seemed unfair to everyone near her, and Nina Rourke's short, precise sentences that always contained exactly what needed to be said. I thought about Clara Fenn at 0300 coming to find me in my bunk, tired and not caring about the tiredness because she had something better. Terminal anomaly, fourth in 8,000 years. I got my notebook out. I carried it through everything, and I still carry it. I wrote down what Venn had said, as closely as I could remember it, because keeping track of things makes them feel like problems with solutions rather than just situations, and because I had learned this from Sam Elliott at 20 years old, writing on a concrete wall, and I had not unlearned it. Then I put the notebook away and walked back through the Vreth platform's corridors toward the docking bay. Garrett was waiting by the ramp of the Obstinate. He had a look that was satisfied and a little tired and not quite finished, which was his default look at the end of something significant, aware that the thing had been completed and aware simultaneously that completion is not the same as done, because the things that come after completion require their own work. "Heading back?" he said. "Heading back," I said. "Flynn found a kettle," he said. "He says this one is better. He always says that. He's usually right, though." We walked up the ramp. The Obstinate's corridors were warm and full of the noise of a crew preparing to move, the particular quality of sound that a ship makes when it is becoming itself again after a period of waiting. And from somewhere down the corridor, faint but clear through the ventilation, Eddie Flynn's voice was carrying the way it always did, the same easy and tuneless confidence he had brought to the storage bay on Kestrel 4 years ago, singing something that had nothing to do with the situation and was exactly what the moment needed. The war was over. The protocol was dead, in the formal sense, nullified by the agreement and by the Sol addendum and by the fact that it had been refused once, which meant it could be refused again, which meant it had never been the law it claimed to be. Down on Earth, the work of recovery was underway. Infrastructure being rebuilt, systems being restored, the long and unexciting and absolutely essential work of putting things back together in ways that were better than before, because there is no point in putting things back together in the exact same form they were in before, unless the form they were in before was good, and not all of it had been good, and some of the people doing the rebuilding knew this and were determined to address it. The Vreth were preparing to formally request dissolution of their administered status. Two other species, whose names I have agreed not to include, were exploring processes they had not previously had access to. The Galactic Council was navigating the implementation of the Soul Addendum with the careful, incremental attention of a body that is doing something it has not done before and is aware that getting it right matters more than getting it fast. I was 35 years old. I had been in the Corps for 9 years. I had been present for the first protocol transmission and the footnote that said no species had ever declined, and I had been present for the moment 4 years later when Ven sat across a circular table and spoke the words that put the cost and the refusal and the outcome into the permanent record, where they would remain as long as records were kept. The obstinate pulled away from the Vreth platform and turned toward home. I went to the forward viewport and watched the platform diminish behind us, a small and careful structure against the enormous and indifferent dark. Around it, in the space that was no longer contested and no longer the edge of someone else's empire, the stars were exactly where they had always been, distant and numerous and completely indifferent to what had just happened in their vicinity, in the way of things that have existed long enough to have no opinion about individual events. We are not that old yet. We have opinions about individual events. We remember them, and we carry them, and we write them down in notebooks, and on concrete walls, and in the preambles of formal agreements, because we have not yet learned, and I hope we never fully learn, to be indifferent to the things that cost us. The sky above Earth was clear. It was ours. It had always been. We were just the first ones to say so out loud, in a room with a circular table and a Kelvoran field commander who had once written a puzzled report about species that laugh during dangerous situations, who had sat across from us and spoken words that he had not planned to speak, because they were accurate, and because he had decided that accuracy mattered more than comfort. He was not wrong about that. About some things, neither were we. Flynn's kettle was, in fact, better.